Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 45 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a restaurant table set for six. Marlene has arrived to host a dinner party to celebrate her promotion at work. She is now the managing director of a recruitment agency called Top Girls. The friends who arrived to celebrate with her are not colleagues from her office or even from her personal life. They are female figures of some renown from different ages of history, ranging from a woman who disguised herself as a man and became Pope in 9th century Italy, through a concubine in the court of 13th century Japan, to a 19th century Scottish explorer, including even two characters from the fictive world, one a figure from a Bruegel painting and another a character from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So begins one of the most extraordinary and brilliant scenes of theater ever conceived, in which six women from across history share their triumphs and challenges, loves and losses over dinner and several bottles of Frascati. Having introduced these time-traveling characters in this dazzling first act, the play takes a remarkable turn to show us a brief snapshot of Marlene's workplace at the recruitment agency, as well as a glimpse of the much more mundane life of her sister and niece, who are living a modest existence in the working class area that Marlene grew up in and escaped to pursue her career. This is Caryl Churchill's modern classic, Top Girls, which premiered at the Royal Court in August 1982 and has been revived many times since, including in 2019 at the National Theatre in a production which is also now available to watch on the National Theatre's at-home streaming platform. Although the play reflected some of the political and social concerns of Britain at the time that it was written in the early 1980s, it is revived and studied on educational curricula because of its extraordinary opening scene and its innovative structure, as well as for its enduring questions about the opportunities and opportunity costs for women who may seek to be top girls. My expert guest today is a returning guest who joined me in episode 30 to talk about Caryl Churchill's play Escaped Alone, Elaine Aston. Elaine is a professor at the Lancaster Institute of Contemporary Arts at Lancaster University, with, as they say on Mastermind, a specialist knowledge of the work of Caryl Churchill, being the author of a monograph on Caryl Churchill, which he has updated in 3 editions published by Northcote House, as well as the editor of the Cambridge Companion to Caryl Churchill and the Cambridge Companion to Modern British Women Playwrights from Cambridge University Press. Elaine is acclaimed for her work on theater research and feminism, publishing several works on feminist theater practice, and currently serves as the president of the International Federation for Theater Research. Welcome back, Elaine. It's lovely to see you. Thanks very much for agreeing to undergo this ordeal again.
Happy to be back. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. When we talked last time, you told me about your early encounters with Churchill's work, and I wondered now, when and where did you first see or come across Top Girls, and what did it mean to you at that time?
Okay, so it was a play I encountered as a script through reading before I came to see it. I didn't see the 1982 premiere, which was at the Royal Court. I did see its revival in, I'm going to say, is it 1991? Also by the court. But so in that gap, it was as a play for reading that I encountered it. In fact, prior to this re-meet, I checked out, because I've got different publications of the play, and actually went back to find the very first copy I owned, which is the one that's based on the original production.
Has it changed in the editions you've...
Well, what it is it's not the actual content of scenes that's changed. It's a structure that's slightly changed. When Churchill originally conceived it, in her head, she saw it as 3 acts, and that is how it's been anthologized. But in the script, the original production, it's set out as 2 acts. So that original restaurant scene was counted as part of Act 1, rather than an act in its own right, which is what Churchill originally had in her head. And she does then go on to state in the anthologized version that it makes most sense to her. And I think, especially if you're new to the play at all, makes most sense to feel the structure of it in those 3-act parts.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk a lot about the structure, but sorry, I interrupted you. You were going to say what it meant to you when you first came across it.
So what it meant, because as I say, I found it by reading rather than seeing initially. I probably came across it by about the mid-80s. And this is when, and I think I said this in our earlier conversation, you were starting to get the kind of first women appointed in small drama departments, and being part of those first token women in drama departments, we were looking to change the syllabus from being so male-dominated. And of course, a play like Top Girls, all female cast, was a gift. I mean, just as an anecdote for a moment, in my very first teaching position, I had about 50 students, about 45 women, 5 guys. And that gender breakdown hasn't gone away. You want more parts for women. Typically, women in the classroom were very used to having to cross-dress all the time, didn't get any of it. But you did sort of think at some point, oh, please, can we have plays with larger casts for women? So Top Girls was a gift from that point of view. But the other thing I'd mention that was also happening at this time was in the university higher education setting, we were also wanting to think how to approach women's theatre as we started to get plays we could work with from theoretical and critical perspectives. And again, Churchill's Top Girls was a gift for that because she's both creative and critical. It's a theatre of ideas, but always brilliantly and excitingly presented. So her work was a gift for helping us to think through the kinds of feminist approaches to women's work that began to burgeon then and onwards across the years. So those are the 2 reasons why.
That's a fascinating perspective, the way you came to it from your academic position and reading it from the text as well, because I have a very strong visual memory of the first production at the Royal Court, which was shortly after I arrived in London from Canada. What I remember is the exotic opening scene where this stage was crowded with this bizarre collection of historical characters. It was so visually striking in their disparate exotic costume and so disorienting in the mashup of time that this scene represents, which we'll talk about. But I still have this kind of glowing image of that assembled cast. I was at the time probably quite puzzled by what was going on, but still it found it exhilarating.
Well, I've just got to say now you've made me totally jealous because I would have loved to have seen that original production. It's one of my big regrets that I missed that.
We all have our regrets of things we missed, and that's the very nature of theater. It's ephemeral, isn't it? But yeah, I was lucky in that case. I was going to ask you next, where does Top Girls fit into Caryl Churchill's career in its subject, in its themes, in its form generally? Where is it in the sort of span of her career?
So back in the 80s, I think this is a phase, let's call it, it's a very crude way of putting it, but let's call it Churchill's Brechtian phase. It's as you go into the 80s, this is coming in the wake of her having worked with alternative theatre companies, especially joint stock with Max Stafford Clark, who also directed Top Girls. And what she's getting from that, which is a new experience of these exposure to workshopping techniques, that's new because before she was in a kind of a solitary writing phase, ideas about democratizing the stage, not being hierarchical like you have in mainstream theatre, but sharing, democratizing, and very much investing in, again, for shorthand way of putting it, presentational rather than representational. That's where it kind of relates to the Brechtian legacies. I put Top Girls in that Brechtian phase, although I should more accurately state Brechtian feminist phase. We can come back to that because it's a whole mapping of both a kind of class socialist interests and feminist concerns too. But basically, what she's doing in the 80s is working through to hone her critique of the Thatcherite 80s, and we will definitely come back to that, I think, and her critique of a nation that she's seeing increasingly divided into the haves and have-nots. And you find that in Top Girls. You can find it again in Fen, which comes the year after in 1983, which is the one set in the Fenlands and the women workers there who are oppressed. And also coming at it from a different perspective, Serious Money in 1987, which is her satire on this explosion of people making ridiculous amounts of money on the stock market. But it's a concern with the direction that Britain is going in the 80s.
I think it's fascinating what you're saying about presentational rather than representational. And it's a subtle but important point, I think, in a way that you said earlier, that it's a theater of ideas. And she definitely, behind the play the whole time, although, you're watching individual characters, as we'll come to, the themes are there. She's speaking to you through these characters about the themes that she wants to elucidate and explore about the times we live in, as you just said. Before we get into that detail, though, I'd like to give listeners who don't know the play well some idea of what it actually is about, who's involved, what happens. And don't worry about spoilers here. We have to dig deep into it. But could you give us a brief synopsis of what it consists of and also introduce us to these historical characters that join Marlene for her dinner party in Act 1?
Yeah, well, in some ways, I think you're almost getting us there with your lovely introduction. Thinking about this, because I know you asked for the plays to be introduced, I thought it'd be interesting for listeners just to hear something that Churchill said about the genesis of this play, where the ideas came from, because that also actually can nicely lead on to a summary of what actually happens. So she, I think, again, said this in the other conversation we had. She stopped giving interviews a long time ago, but back in the 80s, she was still doing some interviews. And there's an interview that she gave in 1983 for Vogue. And that's where she talks about how she got the ideas for Top Girls and how those ideas synthesized. There are three key ones. One is the idea that she had about people from the past coming together to have coffee with somebody in the present. She imagined this actress friend of hers, having a coffee with these people from the past. The second one was to have a play with lots of women. She had that in mind, and that sort of evolved into women in different jobs.
Right.
Okay, so that was the second one. And then the third one was her having thoughts, reflections about this issue of women and success and what it meant to be a successful woman because of Thatcher becoming Prime Minister in 1979.
Yes.
So if you've got those three...
That's brilliant, yes.
You can see how they start to synthesize into the play that we have. So people from the past, that idea becomes your dinner party, Marlene being the contemporary Top Girl. But this is where the characters gather from the past, these characters from art, history, and literature. We'll come back to them in a moment.
Yeah.
Then picking up on this idea, well, it's got to be lots of women, it's all women, but women with different jobs. This is where we then come to Marlene, who's our figure that we follow all the way through. She's our through line, but she's now in the contemporary setting of her employment agency, where we see other women, a couple of other top dogs alongside Marlene, interviewing other women who are less empowered and difficult to place in the job market. So we've got the employment scenes, but then we also get the introduction of this one other strand, which crystallizes ultimately in that final act, which is domestically set between sisters Marlene and Joyce.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have Marlene, Top Girl, sister Joyce left back in the sticks, the left behind, the sister that's left behind. And it's important with that to understand that Joyce has care of Angie, who actually is Marlene's biological daughter. So Angie has been left with Joyce so that Marlene can pursue her Top Girl career. In other words, you can't do both. So we've got a separation of those two things. And that comes to a big discussion about class in that final scene, which I think that we'll park that one for now. I think it makes most sense at the moment to come back to the first act and the historical characters. And if we, between us, could say more about them.
Yeah.
I mean, I just had this one other note. This also comes from the interview when Churchill's explaining the ideas for Top Girls. Is she also observes that she had some notes about Dolgret, who is one of the dinner guests in that opening scene, and that she talks about having the image of Dolgret in her head from the Bruegel painting, which from that she takes away this idea of imaging a working class woman in some way. So Dolgret's there as one of our dinner guests.
Before we launch into the dinner guests, that's a great start because the three things are very clearly evident in the play, as you said. The idea of the people from the past, when we're going to get into those people from the past in the whole first act. But the thing you were saying as well about the employment agency, there's that middle scene where we see Marlene at her workplace and we see some of her other female colleagues. We see them interviewing some potential candidates, other women for other jobs. So it gives us quite a glimpse, as you said, as item number 2, I think it was, the different jobs available to women at the time, what that meant, the world of work for women at that time. The first act, as you said, is then followed by introducing us to Marlene and Angie, who is actually her daughter, but who is being brought up by Marlene's sister, Joyce, and they refer to Aunt Marlene as Angie's aunt. So they don't tell her that she's her real mother. Marlene got pregnant at age 17. Joyce volunteered to look after the coming baby because she was already married and hadn't had children yet, allowing, of course, Marlene, as you said, to leave the sticks and go and pursue a different life and career in London. And then the last act is Marlene comes back. She hasn't been back to visit Joyce or Angie for 6 years. She's left that life behind. And she comes back to visit, and she and Joyce argue quite a lot at that point because they have differing views about how their lives have gone and the politics of the time, as we'll come to, as you alluded to. But let's go back then to the start. The most amazing thing is this strange collection of historical figures. And who are these figures and why did she choose them?
The first thing to say is that Churchill didn't choose, if you're going to have historical figures, you might choose some obvious suspects. Like if you have Queen Victoria at your dinner table, I think people might know who Queen Victoria was, but she doesn't go for that. She goes for figures that one might reasonably not be so familiar with. And you may have something to say about this in relation to seeing that first production. The way it works in the first scene is you don't get characters offering long introductions of themselves. It's all broken up. You've got snippets here and there, and you have to start piecing it together. It's only towards the close of Act 1 when patient Griselda, now she is the figure from Chaucer, and she's the last to arrive. It's only when she enters, and then Marlene does this brief introduction of everybody's there, which I guess if you're in the audience and you're still puzzled, it's a moment when it all becomes much clearer about exactly who all these women are.
That's exactly right. I mean, having come back to this, of course, I knew something about who they were, I guess. And when you read it, you get a chance to figure that out. There's a very brief introduction to each character in the text. But when you're watching it, there's no exposition that very simply gives you this until, as you say, 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the first scene, where you start to learn the specific identities of these characters who are all dressed in different era clothing and come from different parts of the world, different times in history, speak differently. You get the idea that these are people from history, but you don't know specifically really who they are, although they're giving you snippets of what their life's about, aren't they? But who are these people? Let's just reel off who they are, I guess, Elaine.
So we have Pope Joan from the 9th century, and that's a figure I guess people might fathom out fairly quickly because it's a figure that's been represented a lot in fiction and in some film forms and so forth. So that's a figure people might latch on to quite quickly, the idea of a woman who is actually Pope.
She pretends to be a man and is discovered and meets a tragic end.
Stoned to death in the streets. Actually, that's a really interesting moment when it comes up when she's talking about being stoned to death in the streets because they're laughing 1 minute and then, oh my God, we've got to stop laughing now. When she's working with these characters, it's not a kind of reverential. We should remember when we're going through these, there's a lot of playfulness and unexpectedness about how they're being treated. So anyway, so we have Joan, we have Isabella Bird, The Victorian Traveller. You would not, I don't think, be so familiar, but I did try to follow in Churchill's footsteps by following her research sources, which included Pat Barr's A Curious Life for a Lady, which is a biography of Isabella Bird. And the other one is It's Possible to Read About Lady Nijo. Again, there's a study of her courtesan life.
Who have we missed? Have we missed anybody?
Or we haven't had, so Lady Nijo, I've just mentioned, who's the emperor's concubine, and then another phase of her life is a Buddhist nun wandering around Japan. Now we have my favourite character, Gret, the doll Gret, from the Rugel painting. And we mentioned Patient Griselda from Chaucer. Also, it's pointed out by Marlene from Boccaccio and Petrarch, mentioned in there, who has the story of being the very obedient wife.
Yes. In fact, and that is told in some detail in the first act. We learn of what she's been through. Her husband tests her obedience by taking away her children and then saying he's going to marry someone else. And she's obedient to the end, which is why she's called Patient Griselda, I think, presumably because she endures all of the ignominies inflicted on her by her paranoid husband with some patience.
Every decision Churchill makes is a purposeful one. And with Griselda, you could ask yourself, why is she the last to arrive? But it's like her turning up, telling this terrible story. But in turn, that story becomes a catalyst for this outpouring of very angry, upset emotion that we get by the end of Act One, which ultimately culminates in an outpouring from Doll Gret, who's been very monosyllabic all the way through. So we get the stories of achievement and discontents that were running through that first act. They're purposefully drawn into this climactic conclusion to that act through this orchestration of who were meeting when.
These are indomitable, independent-minded figures largely, and they would not necessarily be sympathetic to the obedience that Griselda displays. They'd be puzzled by that and in fact start to become angry on her behalf. And that inspires, as you say, motivates some of their response thereafter. Gret, as you mentioned, was in the painting. The painting is about her going into hell and fighting devils. She was living in Flanders, which was occupied by Spain, and they were with constant oppression. And in fact, Doll Gret's children have been killed by Spanish soldiers. And so finally, it's a sort of act of rebellion, of outrage that she's going to fight back and leads other women into hell to fight the devils. I mean, these are all, as you said, not necessarily obvious characters initially, but all independent, different kinds of independent, strong-minded characters. And I wondered, you talked about how it's woven together. What is it about this assembly and this scene that makes it so innovative and electrifying to watch?
Yeah. Can we bring in the form of it rather than just the characters? Because it's really important to note this is Churchill's first major play using the overlapping dialogue, which he pioneered in our British stage. Part of it is how you orchestrate these voices together. It's like a musical composition. I think incredibly demanding of a director to get it right. Because I think when I said before about these women, you get the snippets of the stories. You sort of got to pick them up, but it's also important that they're not continuous. You get a bit here, a bit there, so that we're constantly having to stay with it, constantly puzzling out who these women are and piecing together their stories for ourselves. And crucially, what you said about these independent women, they're very individualistic in a way. Half the time, they're not listening to each other. And of course, again, thinking about directing it, you've got to get across that sense that they're all in some ways in their little boxes. This happened to me, that happened to me, occasionally interacting, but with this strong sense of not being able to have much empathy for each other. I mean, again, there are notes of it, oh my goodness, Joe, did that, we better stop laughing, but there's not really there in depth.
You're absolutely right about the language. I was going to ask you about the overlapping dialogue, because it's specifically indicated in the text, isn't it? Precisely where the dialogue has to overlap. So it's obviously deliberate. It's interesting in watching it. in practical terms, it can actually be difficult sometimes to separate and hear every line even.
Yes.
And as you say, those stories are coming through in snippets as a result, and they're not listening necessarily to each other. It creates this kind of energy, certainly, but it's almost competitive at times, isn't it?
Exactly.
These are alpha women, aren't they? Who are telling their own stories and are used to being center stage, I guess, in whatever way. So why does she do this? Because this is challenging, as you said, it's challenging to listen to and watch. Why would she not separate them more? What is she trying to do by combining them into this single piece of music?
Well, because I think it is, I refer to them being individuals or individualistic. She doesn't want them listening to each other, in a sense. It wouldn't work. You've got to have a sense of clashing between women, because the whole thrust of the play is this is what's missing. If you don't have a kind of feminism that enables women to be supportive of each other and across classes, across experiences, the minute it all becomes kind of high achieving, pushing others down, for Churchill, that doesn't work.
And about individuals rather than collectively. It implies a criticism that the women have failed to learn from each other's experience. They're not listening to each other, but also that combining into a larger single voice, almost that their stories merge into being a collective voice of women's experience, potentially.
Well, that is true, that if you're listening to the snippets, then, the spectator, the reader of the play can start to work out what the common threads are. So they may not be doing it between them because they're not paying enough attention, but we, as the listeners, the readers, can do that. So then what we get from that first act is this sense of how damaging a patriarchal fabric is to these women throughout history to the present. So we hear stories about fathers bartering their daughters away. We hear about terrible husbands like patient Griselda's obedience demanding Walter. We hear about women losing their children. So we build up this picture about a patriarchal past that we still haven't lost.
Yes, and their common experiences, challenges that even over centuries that they've been forced to face. I'm going to ask you about the structure now, because we talked about this first scene could almost be a play in itself.
Yeah.
And so I want to ask you, what happens that, we talked earlier about these three different things she was inspired by or thinking about, but it leads to quite an abrupt, jarring change in this play. We have this, what I would describe as dazzling and cacophonous first scene with these historical figures. And the second act opens with just the two young kids, Angie, 16-year-old, and Kit, I think he was 12, in the back garden of Joyce's house. Very quiet, just the two of them. You don't even really sure initially, what is the connection from what we've just seen? And then it unfolds from there, as we've described earlier, in more domestic scenes, more naturalistic in some ways, I suppose. At least the people are all from the same time zone, so to speak. Why does she do this? It's a really startling change of style and focus and subject, really, in the middle of this play. It's almost like two different plays that we're watching.
Okay, so I think that the different things one could say about that, about the why. But I think one of the key things to move from that first act with these women from the past to the contemporary, for me, that comes back to the Brechtian influences at this point. When we think about Brechtian distancing alienation techniques, one of the things that they're core to is if you want to get a handle on what's happening in the present, when you want to make your audiences see what's going on around you, it's quite hard when we're in the present and you're talking about the present. So if you use a device like that dazzling first scene that has these figures from the past with Marlene in the contemporary, and then Marlene leads us into contemporary other scenes, we've got this device that makes us think, hang on, are we that much further in our what was then the 1980s present? It's using the past to kind of shine a light on the present, using the distance to be able to see it. It's like I say, when you're in it, it's much harder to see that political landscape. So it works in that way. I think also, and again, I'm thinking back to comments that Churchill made at the time, because one of the things that was happening, because she'd done Vinegar Tom, she'd done the sexual politics, Cloud 9. So people were starting to ask her about being a woman writer or working on women topics. And what does that mean in terms of the form of your writing? Now, she's always been very careful about being called a woman writer and saying, well, depends what that label means. But in terms of form, she'd certainly been thinking about, well, she talked about it as the maleness of the traditional structure of plays, which she described as conflict and building in ways towards a climax, and thinking about, well, that isn't what I'm doing. I mean, she didn't have a clear answer to being asked, what's a kind of feminist aesthetic, what's a female aesthetic, and being clear that there's no definitive way of answering that. But certainly, again, thinking about traditional forms and the maleness of that, and becoming aware of that and not working in that way.
That's really interesting that she's rejecting the easy conventional narrative solutions, which you described as masculine, because actually, of course, the world isn't simple like that. And particularly a women's world wasn't simple like that. And she's not looking to present simple solutions or easy answers. It's quite a bit of a mess, actually. And that's the point. That's part of the point. And that also, going back to what you're saying about the Brechtian approach, I guess what happens is that we instinctively, because we're jarred by this change, and because we see the past and the present side by side in some form, she's asking us to work out what is the connection between these, which of course is the point. I read somewhere that the most important effect of the structure of the play is to establish the interconnectedness of women's experience over time, place, class, all these different experiences of it.
Yeah, I agree that those connections, but there's another slant to bring to it as well. The time leaps when we're in the contemporary, so that we end up back earlier than when we first started in those contemporary scenes. And that, again, is a kind of temporal dislocation, disjunction that opens up in that Brechtian way the dialectical possibilities of it needn't have happened like that. So there was an alternative way. Things could have gone differently. So instead of a continuous causal, it's all going in this direction, it's kind of putting a spanner in the works. So again, you're making the connection, you're standing back and you think, well, it didn't have to go that way. I mean, I found just rereading the play before this meeting and the scene in which Angie turns up in the employment agency and Marlene's okay, she greets her, but she and Marlene's colleagues are quite dismissive. And I found myself thinking, could you not just give her a helping hand? Oh, dear.
It's heartbreaking to watch, actually. And I think we didn't sketch out what happens in our introduction. So the last scene, as you say, takes place a year before the scenes in the employment agency. And we see in the employment agency, Angie just turns up out of the blue, has actually left home and come to London on her own, has an idea naively that at 16, she might get a job there and stay with Auntie Marlene, who she idolizes. But of course, this is a pipe dream that's never going to happen. And it's excruciating to watch because we know it's never going to happen. She hasn't got any qualifications. And Marlene doesn't really want her there. And as you said, that whole idea, though, that it could have been different. You see the last scene, a year before this occurs, Marlene has come home to visit, as we said. And the interaction she has, she could have reacted differently. All through her life, she could have reacted differently. And Angie's prospects and future would be different as a result, wouldn't it? So the form, has a lot to do with how we think about what she's exploring, clearly. Let me ask you about the context back in the 1980s. I think, to quote you, in fact, from our last episode, you suggested that one of Churchill's distinguishing traits was that she dramatized the anxieties that dominated a particular time. So if we look back to the time when she was writing Top Girls, the early 1980s, what was our society preoccupied with at that time that she wanted to reflect and explore in the play?
I'd say top of the list for Churchill at this time is the direction that feminism is going in. She'd been over to the States in, I think that was 1979. And she talked about being worried about what she saw over there in terms of the number of women becoming high achievers, by which was meant, becoming kind of vice president of some sort of high-flying industry. And thinking to herself, but that's not what feminism is for me. And this is where, coming back to the genesis of the play and her ideas and that worry about Thatcher becoming prime minister, and, you could say, oh, well, wonderful, we've got a woman prime minister, there's a first. And Churchill was very clear that she could not entertain the idea of something that you'd call right-wing feminism. It's anathema to put those two things together. There has to be this meshing of socialism and feminism. So you're attending to both gender and class, as it was talked about then. And I think that's behind Top Girls, that's the most pressing issue. Coupled with, in that same terrain, is given that what happened in the 80s with Thatcherism was the promotion of to women, you can have it all. Whereas what Churchill is saying is, how do you put together work and parenting? How can you be working mothers, particularly if you're from a working class background and you can't afford childcare? So at the heart of all this, and this is where the figure of Angie is really important, is it's the future generations that you're caring for in a capitalist society that doesn't provide us with
it's not providing any collective support for your society. It's Thatcher's famous pronouncement, there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women and their families. They're just individuals. And of course, her free market form of economics and the individualism of that time. And of course, as you said, she was hardly a feminist model.
No.
Having reached the highest position in politics, she was not a feminist model because her behavior sought to mimic the behavior associated with male power. And we see that, of course, in the workplace scenes as well, with the way the women are behaving. The only way that they can progress and succeed is by emulating the men, dressing like them, not showing any signs of weakness, being, in fact, not nice deliberately, for example. But as you said, it's these twin concerns we talked about previously, that feminism and socialism together is what she addresses through her plays. And clearly, she's looking at both in this play. One of the central themes seems to me in terms of the feminism, one is about the opportunities available. And as you say, about Angie and the future generations, but even the historical figures and the women of today who we see in the office, who have come for interviews, or what are those opportunities available to women in a patriarchal society? What are the obstacles they face? How have they changed or not? We see in the first act, all those different individuals from history have faced those obstacles in different forms, but still obstacles, because it's been largely a patriarchal society, of course.
Well, that's right, because I think the agency scenes, they illuminate what some of the current obstacles are. I mean, I said earlier that the top girls in the agency don't give the best helping hands for those looking for employment. So you get the kind of women who are coming forward looking for jobs. They want the adventures too. We hear about that. They'd like to get up the ladder. They'd like to. Travel's a big motif in the agency, which is also picked up from the first act. They'd like jobs that would get them out and about. But none of that is on offer. It's the hierarchies that are up against. You also hear about how age is becoming an obstacle. When they interview a woman, in her mid-40s, it's like, oh, well, you're up against younger generations of men or younger generations of women. Young women are the go-getters. Young men will fare better because the gender divide still favours them. So yes, it's always connecting back past to present, but using those employment agency scenes specifically to illuminate some of the obstacles that women are facing.
In that time, and I thought the way that the women in the agency react to their clients, to the candidates, is actually pretty distinctly unhelpful.
Yes.
It's ironic, isn't it? Because they see themselves, the women who work in the agencies, as successful. But they see all of the others who are coming to them as not in their mold, because the jobs that they're talking about for all these others are, as we remember, secretaries, typists, PAs. They're all jobs basically working for men in what was the old-fashioned hierarchy of the offices and the tasks they're in. And so in a way, the women in the agency are exceptions to those because they're doing their own jobs, actually. And so they feel like they've somehow escaped that, but they're not really helping their candidates to do the same. There are other aspects, that, as we said, about they have to pass as men at work, they have to behave as men at work. And yet also talking about the new generation of women that are coming through that are more self-confident, like Wynne and Nell, who work in the agency, who dress differently, who believe in themselves, who believe in their potential future, are not going to take the obstacles lying down. By contrast, there's the woman in her 40s who's been with the same company all her life and has done an amazingly capable job quietly, never put her head above the parapet, and will only be missed when she leaves, but has been passed over and hasn't got the ambition. But she even recognizes that she's out of step with these younger women and doesn't really know how to behave like them. That seems to be required to succeed. It's a pretty damning portrait of the working world in all sorts of ways, not just from the patriarchy, but even from the way the women themselves behaving.
Well, no, that's right. And I think that's Churchill's point. That's her objection to this idea of right-wing feminism. We can't conceive of that. And, this whole Top Girl syndrome, we shouldn't be behaving this hierarchical class way that means that you are unhelpful, detrimental to those that class-wise require that hand up.
Let's come back to another one of those major feminist issues you identified, which is about being a mother and having a career, and that challenge that is explored in the play. There's a moment when Marlene gets promoted, and she's promoted in favor of a man in the office, Howard, and his wife, Mrs. Kidd, comes into the office the day after this has all occurred and tries to ask Marlene to give up her promotion, to allow her husband to have the job, because he's so devastated at being passed over, particularly by a woman. In fact, he's so devastated he won't be able to work for a woman. And she says, though, when Marlene says no, well, basically, fuck off, I'm not, why would I do that?
Yes.
Mrs. Kidd says, you're one of those ball breakers. You'll end up miserable and lonely. You're not natural. So there was this whole question about what is natural for a woman. And the workplace, there's this view, even by a woman, that that's not natural for her to be pursuing her career and that she'll be lonely and miserable. And actually, of course, there's some degree, Marlene is a bit lonely and miserable, although she has chosen her path, clearly. But at the core of the play, all of this has happened because she has literally given up her child to be free to pursue her independent life. And as you said earlier, that the historical women talk about what their lives were as mothers. And almost all of them have had problems. They've had to give up children. They haven't been in control to be able to be a mother and this alpha woman, top girl. It seems incompatible.
No, I think she's absolutely putting the problem of how do you have both those things? It's not that she's trying to say women shouldn't have adventures in the way that Marlene represents all those women from the past, with the various adventures that they had. It's not saying they shouldn't, but it is the cost of those and coming up the cost of particularly looking after children. And it reminds me of, back in the 70s, one of the feminist demands was for 24-hour nurseries provided by the state. Free childcare, 24-hour basis. We never got anything like that, but it was back there on the feminist table in the 70s. That could have helped solve this problem about how you can have some of your adventures and not have to feel that you can't combine that with having children and keeping your children rather than having to have, another family member look after them, as was the case between Marlene and Joyce. And I'd still say today we haven't got all that sorted either while we're on this topic. And it's always, again, it's the working class women back in the play represented by Joyce that suffer the most in terms of being able to afford to go out to work at all if they have children.
Yes, what are we to make of Joyce then, by contrast to Marlene, who's chosen to leave Angie behind and as a result has left her working class home? But Joyce has not been able to get out, so to speak. She's got 4 cleaning jobs to make ends meet and not much prospect of changing that. What does Churchill make of her character? Is there some suggestion she hasn't tried hard enough to do what's needed for her own life?
I think this is Churchill again working up, rather than psychology of character, it's putting it on this big political landscape that it's raising it above kind of individual characters and the psychology thereof. We don't get that anywhere, I don't think, in this play. It's generally not what you find in Churchill's work. And I'm not saying these makes them two-dimensional either. I'd argue that she is interested in raising it above just us getting drawn into one story of individual character, so that we are thinking about this larger political picture, and in particular the kinds of things we've just been talking about. That's what she always works towards, the epic picture. So it's not about an individual story of Joyce, it's where Joyce fits into this larger picture, which really crystallizes in that last act.
Yes, it does, because they have this overtly political debate, don't we?
It's an explicitly class, it brings out the class warfare, which is also part of the Thatcherite project in the 80s. Dismantled working class. Joyce would still support the unions, support the labour movement. That's all going. It will go throughout that decade, particularly with the miners' strike in the mid-80s. Marlene, of course, is voicing the opposite. She's there. The 80s are going to be stupendous, aces, high flying, wonderful. But it's not for Joyce, and she's voicing that working class position.
Yes, the Thatcherite belief in the free market, the individuals. Marlene wants to wipe away what she thinks are the restrictions of class. I don't believe in class. Anyone can do anything if they've got what it takes, she says. And Joyce, as you said, remains a traditional labor, like their father. And it's partly to do with the hierarchy of society. I mean, Marlene, like a true Thatcherite, rejects the us and them, the working class and the unions versus the management. But Joyce, of course, defends the unions are the right to protect people. And of course, the whole of the welfare state ultimately comes down to what is there to support those who don't succeed. If it's a dog-eat-dog world, not everyone succeeds at this. And in fact, this is where it becomes most pointed with Angie, doesn't it? Because this is where the political debate becomes personal.
Exactly.
In that Angie, as we said earlier, so she has left school at 16 with no qualifications. She's not particularly smart. She seems young for her age, naive. I don't know exactly how charitably to describe her, but in fact, Marlene is not very charitable about the way she describes her, because when she turns up at the agency and some of her colleagues ask her about her and what she's going to do, and she's looking for a job, Marlene says she's not going to make it. She'll be a packer in Tesco, which she says quite disdainfully. And it's hard not to agree with her that she's not going to make it. But of course, coupled with that, then later, as you say, in their debate, she talks about how if you're not succeeding, it's because you're lazy and you're frightened and you're stupid, lazy, and frightened. And Joyce's pointed response to that is, well, what about Angie? She's stupid, lazy, and frightened. What happens to her?
Well, this is why that final one-word line that Angie has, frightening, I think that just says it all with that one word.
I thought that was so clever of her, because where I've just described, where they describe the unemployed working class or Angie as stupid, lazy, and frightened, so she's frightened, but the point of frightening is slightly different. What happens is Angie comes down, she's been put to bed, but she comes down, she's been having a nightmare or something, and she comes down into the kitchen again where Marlene is left to go to bed on the couch. And she just says frightening, as to express what she's feeling or seeing. What is her vision of the world to come, of her life to come, of the prospect? It's frightening. It's not the same as I'm frightened. You think about what is that future? That future is frightening. And the irony, of course, as well, isn't it, Elaine, is that she asks for her mum. Her real mum is there, Marlene, who doesn't respond, doesn't know how to respond. It's heartbreaking, but it represents that political debate that they've just had. Do you think the title of the play is ironic? Where does Churchill's sympathies ultimately lie in this debate about being a top girl or succeeding or not, or staying at home? Or
I think it's like I said before, it's not that she's trying to say women shouldn't, have their adventures. This is not going to argue that they should stay at home. But then, it's back to again, those questions about how do you manage the adventures of success as well as the family life and all the parenting. So I think the title for me is more like I'd say Top Girls ? And remember, I said when we met before that Churchill's always of the view, or she said very early on, that the playwright's job is to ask the questions, not to give the answers. So in a sense, she's putting these problems out there for us in this Brechtian way. She's presenting them, she's asking us to see them. So she's asking us to be part of the thinking and the solving between us. It shouldn't have to be like this. What needs to change?
We talked earlier about how this play is of its time and how Churchill wants to reflect the anxieties of the time. This was written in 1982. Does any of it now feel dated, or does it still speak to the anxieties of our time? And we've talked about, we can recognize and talk about this history of Thatcher in the 1980s. But why do we keep reviving it now then?
I think it still absolutely does speak to the anxieties of now. I mean, it was a State of the Nation play, I'd say, in 1982, and it's still a State of the Nation play because we haven't been able to get out of the neoliberal regime that Thatcher introduced. In fact, it's got worse. The inequalities got worse. It's even more frightening now, I would say, than back in the 80s. So it makes the play resonate. I know in my case, just personally, I'm now less interested in seeing the dinner scene. I get drawn to Angie, Joyce. That's where my attention's going. And it's partly from having taught the play over many years, that familiarity and students wanting to work on the dinner scene and getting a real buzz out of that, great. But it's the poignancy and how frightening it still is. In the national production, which is the one that is now available through...
It's the National Theatre at Home.
Yeah. Interestingly, they didn't do all the doubling up in that production. They had 17, 18 cast members. So very different to when it was done before with the doubling up of characters, which enabled that presentational style. And I was kind of not quite so convinced with the direction of the dinner scene in that. But I thought what they beautifully captured was the kitchen scene at the end, allowing us kind of stillness and almost like you could feel that you wanted to stop and reflect on Joyce's position and that the beautiful rhythms to that. She stood at one point looking out from the kitchen and you think, yeah, these working class women, what are their lives? What do their futures look out on? We've done so terribly under the political regimes that we've had.
You're absolutely right. I meant to mention when we were talking about the structure about, of course, one of the aspects that Churchill suggested was the doubling up of the characters from the historical through to the contemporary. And the National Theatre production, as you rightly said, did not do that as it did in the original. Of course, doing it emphasizes the interconnectedness between the generations of women, clearly. It's not essential because, there are resonances between the individuals that they double, but it's more the general point, I think, that's made by doubling. But I also was going to say earlier, Elaine, that whole transition from that, what I kept saying, not possibly overemphasizing, the dazzling opening scene to the subsequent scenes, it's bold in that it takes the tenor down, right? It slows it down. It's a quieter play. It's a more domestic, mundane settings, all that. And in some ways, I guess my first exposure to it, I think I found that puzzling and disappointing, possibly, but absolutely right. What you've just described is I just rewatched that National Theatre production last night. And I found myself deeply moved towards the end, that relationship between Marlene and Joyce and those prospects for Joyce and Angie are heartbreaking. And as you said, the relevance, thinking about the cost of living pressures now, you just start to imagine.
I know, it's
the kind of pressures that working class people or people with lower income.
Yeah.
And also, I picked up a couple of quotes about more recent productions that talk about its enduring relevance. Michael Billington said of a revival in 2011-12, it's topical in its portrait of an individualistic society in which few thrive at the expense of the many. That seems pretty true still, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And Time Out said as well, the culture of me pinpoints the moment when success overtook compassion as the cardinal social value. Also seems pretty perceptive.
That so I remembered an image from that 2011-12 revival, which I'd say was also Matt Stafford Clark's. At the close of the dinner scene, they had Dolgret pick up bread rolls. And I think she actually said, let them eat bread. And then she got Joan to bat them out into the audience. So it was which was a wonderful much more playful, I think, than had been done before. But that audience, we need bread, we need the basics. I came across, again, when I was just Googling a few things prior to this meeting, this most peculiar mention of Top Girls. It's on the GCSE list where they list 74 plays. Churchill's Top Girls is the last one, number 74. And as a genre, it's described as historical feminism.
Oh, my God.
I took umbrage at that when I found that. And other ones are called comedies, tragedies, satire, historical feminism. As this is on a national curriculum and be widely studied, somebody needs to intervene in that somewhere.
Actually, one thing we didn't mention is that, again, uncannily, Kit, the young 12-year-old girl, has a few lines in the middle where she talks about her fear of nuclear war and that the only safe place is New Zealand to escape obliteration. And of course, this was prominent in the 1980s. The Cold War was still very much with us. And I think we were all aware of that overriding threat, which we assumed had receded. But clearly, in the last few weeks, there's stark evidence that that's not the case. So
yes,
more relevance to our time. Elaine, thank you. Before I let you go, as you may know, one of the traditions of the podcast, I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might talk about in a future episode, or even that's just a personal favorite. Now, last time, I think you chose Hang by Debbie Tucker Green, which is a great piece. What about this time? Do you have another one you might volunteer?
I have got another one. I haven't checked through everything to see if somebody's already suggested this one.
That's okay. Give it a go.
Yeah, but I would definitely recommend Laura Wade's Posh.
Ah, yes.
Now, that's from 2010. It's been on my mind for two reasons. One is because of Now and Partygate, given that the play is about the riotous dinner of the Top Boys and our Bullingdon Club, which had the likes of Cameron and Johnson as past members. But Laura Wade is still dealing with class. We've got a dinner again, but with the opposite way around. All male cast, all these posh boys, but very much on the class button again. That us and them, and these posh boys behaving badly. And I was thinking, okay, it's working opposite ways in some way, but there are some resonances here. If you think back to Top Girls, forward to Posh.
So I think we have to do it, and we have to call it Top Boys. That's brilliant. So I think I might call you for this one. It's a great choice. Thank you very much. And Elaine, thank you so much for coming back and talking about Caryl Churchill and this play. I'm really grateful for your time and your expertise. Great to see you.
Thank you. Always happy to talk about Churchill.
As the curtain falls on Angie and her dismay at the frightening world she sees, and on the divided sisters who have made such different life choices, what do we feel the play tells us about the anxieties of our time? That the common challenges that women have faced over the centuries remain to varying degree. That opportunities may be more equal, but are not without costs. That we should enable choice, remove unfair constraints, but not prescribe a singular model of success. We should respect and support different choices because we don't all need to be or can be top girls. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.